The first one. He is the president of Andheri Parla Physician Association, a renowned cardiologist from the city and from India also. And sir needs no introduction to this August gathering, and he will be chairing this session. And second will be Dr. Ramesh Darkar sir. Sir is a senior most practitioner in Andheri area, being a great academician and always vouch for academic activity. He's a forefront for all these kind of activities. So I also welcome him. So with this brief introduction, we will start the program, we'll start the proceeding, and I'll ask first Dr. Girish to take us through the endocrine causes of hypertension. So let me introduce Dr. Girish Parmar. He is a very dear friend of us, a wonderful human being, and is a great clinician. He is MD DM in endocrinology. He is currently practicing as endocrine specialist at Nanavati Super Specialty Hospital and his own clinic. He's been thorough academician and he's always been there for Andheri Parland, for all of us to help us and to bail us out whenever there is a need. So with these few words, I welcome Girish to this forum and I'll ask him to start his deliberation and we will be waiting to hear from you, Girish. Girish, all yours.
Sir,
You
you
are
are
on mute.
mute.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Uh, Thank you, Dr. Kapil, for those kind words of introduction. At the outset, I would like to thank Andheri Parla Physician Association for inviting me, as well as JB Pharmaceutical for inviting me. So, my topic today is interesting cases of hypertension, the endocrine aspect to it, and endocrine connect to it. So actually, what I've done is I've renamed my topic as high on hormones, and I'm going to present interesting cases, a couple of them, and if time permits, the third one also. And subsequently, I would hand over the mic to Dr. Sharad Seth, sir. Okay. So the reason being we are discussing hypertension and the hormonal aspect. So if you look at endocrine causes of hypertension, we all know that the adrenal gland produces a vast number of hormones which can contribute to hypertension. If you're talking of adrenal, it can cause, I mean, hyperaldosteronism, pheochromocytoma, Cushing syndrome, congenital adrenal hyperplasia. All these can be part and parcel as an endocrine cause of hypertension. If you were to look at another endocrine gland, that is thyroid, both hypothyroidism as well as hyperthyroidism can cause hypertension. Hyperparathyroidism is also another endocrine disorder which can contribute or be the cause of hypertension. Diabetes mellitus, it's one of the associated comorbidity which is present along with hypertension, which can cause both ways. Uh, Renin secreting tumors are another cause for hypertension and the endocrine angle to it. So let me start with, after enumerating the causes, I'm going to take you through a couple of cases. So if you look at this case, she's a 42-year female, known case of CA breast, underwent bilateral MRM followed by chemoradiation in June 2018. She's complaining of voluntary weight loss with normal appetite. Obviously, here she's attributing that she's put in efforts for the weight loss and her appetite has remained intact. She's also complaining of palpitations. She's postmenopausal since 1.5 years. Sleep has been normal, bowel bladder habits normal, and sister had hypothyroidism. If you look examination wise, weight wise, she's obese, pulse is 90, regular, and bounding. If you look at a blood pressure reading, it's 180 by 60. Obviously, the blood pressure itself gives a clue to the diagnosis, right? I wish it could have been an interactive session, but I think in today's era, probably we'll have to live with it. But I would appreciate if anyone could give the diagnosis at this point of time in the chat box. Okay, saturation is normal. There's no clinical coitum. So if you look at a thyroid function, see the clue over here is that the pulse is quite regular and bounding. It's systolic hypertension with wide pulse pressure that you need to take into consideration. So at this point of time, obviously with wide pulse pressure and bounding pulse with history of palpitations and weight loss in the background, you're looking at thyrotoxicosis as a clinical differential diagnosis. And if you look at her labs, this is in August. She had undergone a surgery in June, and now we are in August. Okay, her TFT is clearly suggestive of thyrotoxicosis. Uh, we've done it on a couple of occasions, and if you look, the T3 is slightly on the upper side of normal, T4 is definitely elevated, and TSH is definitely suppressed. And ironically, what we discovered incidentally was also that the calcium levels are on the upper side. So at this point of time, thyrotoxicosis is my diagnosis. Now, differential, she does not give a history. So, differentials at this point of time could be either a hypothyroid state leading to thyrotoxicosis or a thyroiditis, which is the cause of thyrotoxicosis. Why I say thyroiditis? The reason is the T3 is not elevated. Invariably, in patients with hyperthyroidism, you note that both T3 and T4 both are elevated, whereas in thyroiditis, the degree of elevation in T4 will be much more than T3. Whereas in Graves, T3 is going to be much more. The reason being it's very easy to make a molecule with just 3 iodine atoms. So in hyperthyroidism, T3 is usually very much elevated. Vis-a-vis in thyroiditis, it's the T4. So over here, based on these lab features, I would go more with the diagnosis of thyroiditis. However, history-wise, there was nothing to suggest that there's evidence of thyroiditis. So because I was in a dilemma, I ordered for a thyroid scan. And if you look at the thyroid scan, there's good uptake in the salivary glands, but there's no uptake in the region of the thyroid bed, indicating and confirming that this is a case of thyroiditis as expected. So that was one of the cause why her blood pressure was on the upper side. But simultaneously, you need to keep in mind that her calcium levels were high, and that can also cause you need to dig deep dive as to what was the cause of hypercalcemia, because she's a patient with malignancy in the past, and obviously with that background in mind, whether it's bone metastasis which is there, which is causing humoral hypercalcemia, or hypercalcemia of malignancy, which is another differential diagnosis that you would like to rule out in this patient. So, as a part of workup, a USG of the thyroid was done, and it showed a lesion, which was posterior to the right lobe of the thyroid. Sorry for this. So there was a well-defined 3 centimeter lesion, which was posterior to the right lobe of thyroid. So whether this is part and parcel of the parathyroid gland, and whether that gland is autonomously hyperfunctioning to cause that hypercalcemia is another thought that comes to your mind at this point of time. Now, what do we do in this case? So obviously thyroiditis, which probably was radiation induced, and she has hypercalcemia. So we'll work her up for if it's thyroiditis, we don't need to do just masterly inactivity, and probably with time this will resolve. She'll go into the hypothyroid phase, followed by resolution of this thing. If it's radiation induced, then she will be permanently hypothyroid and will require levothyroxine therapy at the end. Now for hypercalcemia, we need to work her up. So obviously we waited for thyroid, didn't give her anything except to control the pulse. She was put on Ciplar LA, palpitations reduced by about 80%. And if you look, now the T4 has started declining. It's on the lower side. That means she's now going into the hypothyroid phase of toxicosis. So TSH has been normal, has normalized, but calcium over here has again normalized. So this hypercalcemia, was it a part of thyrotoxicosis, came to my mind. So at this point of time, I didn't do anything. We said we'll wait, because see, calcium is 9.3, phosphorus is normal, albumin is normal, everything seems to be okay, but the PTH is still elevated, and in the background we had that small lesion 3 centimeter posterior to the right side. So you need to keep in mind what is happening. So okay, vitamin D was low for this patient, so I said let's replace the vitamin D and then look at what happens to the PTH and the calcium. So we stopped the Ciplar because she had recovered. Okay, BP had come down. She was started on normal calcium diet, and we replaced the vitamin D, and we said we'll observe. Again, in December 2018, she gained another 3 kgs, totally no palpitations. As far as thyroid was concerned, she had become normal. So one of the differentials was radiation-induced thyroiditis. If it was radiation-induced thyroiditis, she would have permanent hypothyroidism. But this TSH had normalized. That means she was fine. And probably this is just a subacute viral thyroiditis and not radiation-induced thyroiditis. So at this point of time, now the calcium again started drifting up with the vitamin D being normal. And with high calcium, the PTH is not suppressed. So obviously in face of hypercalcemia, your PTH levels should have been suppressed to below 15. If you look at the range for PTH, it's usually, it varies from lab to lab, depends on which assay you're using. But by and large, the values are between 15 to 72 picograms per ml. So when your calcium levels are on the upper side, the PTH should definitely be below 30. As far as possible, if you're using a good kit, then probably less than 15, undetectable in presence of hypercalcemia. So obviously this PTH was not suppressed. Now, this is the algorithm as regards to how do you approach hypercalcemia. So this was a case of PTH dependent hypercalcemia, right? So we had measured the PTH and that was high. So PTH dependent hypercalcemia, probably we are dealing with either primary hyperparathyroidism is one of the differential diagnoses. The other case of familial hypocalciuric hypercalcemia probably does not present at this age, so I'm not dwelling much. But subsequently, as I said, it's PTH dependent hypercalcemia. And remember, why I'm discussing this is because this can also be a cause of hypertension. Okay, as a cause of secondary hypertension, though its association with hypertension has not been as strong as other endocrine conditions, but one of the rare conditions is this, where once you treat this, things can improve, not necessarily always, but definitely it can be reversible to some extent once you treat the hypercalcemia, which is PTH driven. So since the PTH was not suppressed, I asked for a parathyroid scan. And as you note that the sesame radioisotope was retained. If you look at the lower image, the sesame radioisotope was retained even late into the lower pole of the right lobe. And lower pole was the area where you saw some lesion, a well-defined lesion on the ultrasound. So whether this is the right-sided lower parathyroid gland, which is hyperfunctioning. We again got a sonography done at our place. And if you note, how many of you would appreciate, but I'm not sure. But if you look at this sonography, this is the thyroid bed. And posterior to this, you see a well-defined nodule over here. I don't know whether my cursor is being displayed over there or not, but I'm not sure. Okay, fine. Dr. Rati says yes. So that's the lesion. Now, we are not very sure, okay, what this lesion was. At the back of our mind, she's a person who's undergone surgery for a malignancy. So whatever this lesion is, we are not very sure. And that small lymph node was also there in the neck region. So we had a multidisciplinary meeting and we had two options. One was to do a USG guided FNAC of the lesion or go in directly operate, remove that lesion, whatever it is, and then take a call. Intraoperatively, one can look at doing a PTH pre-surgery and then just after removal of the lesion, if there's a 50% decline in the PTH levels, that means you remove the culprit parathyroid gland. So that is another way of confirming it. So we were not very sure. So we got a USG guided FNA. And this is what it showed. Few clusters of thyroid follicular cells and inflammatory cells seen. So this was not really helpful for us. I got a redo FNA and I sent it. Okay. And if you look at this redo FNA, it shows that the TTF1 cells are negative. So TTF is a marker on immunostaining which will help you differentiate whether this is thyroid cell, this is a cell which is thyroid in origin or parathyroid in origin. So TTF1 probably negative indicates that this is not thyroid in origin and this was parathyroid in origin, and that supports the diagnosis of hyperparathyroidism. So obviously we were confirmed as regards to our diagnosis as primary hyperparathyroidism being the cause of hypercalcemia. We offered her surgery, but she was not very keen. So in that case, I put her on medical management and with this drug called cinacalcet or PTH. And if you note that her thyroid has been fine, her calcium has been normalized, everything went back to normal. And obviously, just to give you a brief, that she's been following up since then till date, and even her blood pressure has normalized. Obviously, how much was the contribution by thyroiditis and how much was the contribution by hyperparathyroidism? I'm not very sure. But all in all, this was a good case for documenting that some causes of hypertension, though rare, but are reversible, and especially when you look at endocrine causes, a good number of them. So I think I'm not talking about primary hypoparathyroidism anymore. I'll take you to this second case. So I showed you thyroiditis, hypercalcemia, PTH driven causing hypertension. Okay, third case or second case. Yeah, 35-year male. So this is a very interesting case. 35-year male, symptomatic since 2 years, hypertensive since 2 years, uncontrolled. He was referred from some interiors of Maharashtra and he was admitted in a private hospital at Goregaon. Uncontrolled with three antihypertensives. He was hospitalized outside with back pain under an orthopedic surgeon. He had accelerated hypertension to the extent of 210 by 120 and had landed up with seizures requiring intubation for 5 days. So he was hospitalized at Goregaon. And I was referred after 5-7 days in view of secondary hypertension. Okay. Uh, Obviously, because they had worked him up, couldn't figure out what was happening, then that is the time when I was called. If you look at him, he was quite lean, quite lean. His heart rate was 94. Peripheral pulses were well palpable. He was on medication, so currently his blood pressure was 130 by 80. He was on Stamlo 5 milligrams, Prolomet, and Prasupress along with Levipil. He was lean. There was no evidence of any Cushing syndrome. Thyroid was not palpable. No carotid or renal bruit. He was worked up extensively before I was asked to see him. So if you look at him, hemoglobin was 13.8, counts being normal, platelets were normal. Electrolytes are very important when you look at secondary causes. And his sodium was 131, potassium was 3.8. Creat has been normal, but there was some degree of end organ damage in the form of proteinuria. And that was his 2D echo report. Because he landed up with seizures, a CT brain was done, which showed normal, no significant findings. A renal Doppler was asked prior to me seeing him, which showed a large 5 centimeter mass in the left para-aortic region. No evidence of renal artery stenosis. So CT scan abdopelvis was also done, which concurred the same finding of a large mass in the left para-aortic region at the level of the inferior mesenteric artery. And they noted that both the adrenal glands were normal. So somehow they asked for an MRI also after a CT scan. And this is the MRI report, that a well-defined cystic necrotic lesion with thick wall is seen in the left para-aortic region below the level of left kidney. It's around 4 centimeter, hyso-intense on T1 and hyper-intense on T2. So at this point of time, obviously since the adrenal gland was normal, what we were looking at is whether this is a case of paraganglioma. And a secretory form of paraganglioma, which is causing that degree of elevation in blood pressure. So he was worked up, and what was done was a plasma aldosterone concentration and a plasma renin concentration. And if you look at the ratio between of the two, that is PSC PRC ratio, which was normal. So obviously there was no evidence of hyperaldosteronism at this point of time. 24-hour urinary metanephrines were normal. and 24-hour urinary VMA was done, which was slightly on the upper side. So obviously, when you're looking at PAC PRA ratio, these are some drugs which need to kept in mind, and which needs which, because they affect the ratio, so we need to keep in mind. And how they affect the ratio is, this is a very important slide. Why I'm harping on this is because majority of the patients would be on a ACE or ARB, and in on an ACE or ARB, if you find that the potassium levels are on the lower side, in spite of being on ACE or ARB, then you keep a high index of suspicion for hyperaldosteronism. That in spite of these drugs, if your net ratio is on the upper side, or if there's hypokalemia, then the pretest probability for hyperaldosteronism is quite high. So you should always, when you're looking at a patient with secondary hypertension, you should always look at the potassium levels. Is it low or not? Because if it's low, then obviously this is not the dictum any longer. But if it is present, then the index of suspicion should be very high. However, having said that, even if you have normal potassium levels, still your eyes and mind should be open for the diagnosis of hyperaldosteronism, because a good number of patients with primary hyperaldosteronism will have a normal potassium level. Okay, so this is a slide which basically shows on one side the synthetic pathway, on the other side the catabolic pathway for the adrenal cortex. And the VMA which was done for this patient, which was on the upper side, metanephrine was normal, normetanephrine was not tested for. So if you look at whenever you're suspecting pheochromocytoma, or whenever you're suspecting a paraganglioma, what we always ask for is free metanephrine, free normetanephrines, because if you notice that the sensitivity of free metanephrines and normetanephrines is quite high, 97% and 99%. Vis-a-vis, if you ask for catecholamine levels or VMA levels, then the sensitivity is only 50%. So you're bound to miss out a few cases, good number of cases. So whenever you're suspecting PO or paraganglioma, one of the message that I would like to give is always ask for plasma-free metanephrines or plasma-free normetanephrine levels rather than VMA. Okay, and at this point of time, like to reiterate that no dietary restrictions are needed. You need to just send the samples in EDTA. Can be done at any point of time. You don't need morning fasting samples anymore, and no need for supine or anything of that sort. So I leave the slide. So at this point of time, what I did for this patient is asked for a TSH, cortisol, plasma-free metanephrines, plasma-free normetanephrines, calcium and calcitonin. Why I asked for calcium and calcitonin is because obviously we are looking at paraganglioma, and is it a part of any Men's syndrome? Is it a part of any syndrome, because he's a young chap? And these were the values. Thyroid was normal, cortisol was normal, calcium came normal, calcitonin was normal. So there was no evidence of medullary thyroid carcinoma. There was no evidence of hypercalcemia. So men was ruled out. Plasma-free normetanephrines were elevated, but just borderline elevated. And I'm not very sure whether this can explain that degree of hypertension. Because remember, 210 by 120, uncontrolled, 3 drugs since long standing. I mean, and your metanephrines, normetanephrines are just borderline. So I'm not sure. At this point of time, what I did was I withheld his calcium channel blocker, I increased his alpha blocker, and continued with Prolomed. I asked for a MIBI scan to see whether there's any uptake in that. Because if I believe it was functional, then it should have some uptake. However, there are false negative cases with MIBI also. Okay, so I left it at that. I increased his alpha blockade further and up-titrated the beta blockers. And obviously, then the plan was to undergo a surgery. So this is an FDG scan and a PET DOTA scan, which I asked for him. And if you look at the mass, it is well circumscribed mass, very well circumscribed central necrotic area. And mind you, though the imaging can sometimes be misleading, and probably these are all, one thing to remember is clinical examination, clinical findings, and clinical correlation is very, very important. Your labs only supports your clinical diagnosis. So per se, lab is not uh, confirmatory for diagnosis, but you just need to support your diagnosis with labs. So over here, the MIBG did not show any uptake. The FDG scan did not show a significant uptake. I got a DOTA scan which did not show a significant uptake over here. But when this mass was removed, his blood pressure came down drastically. So I think obviously, so this sometimes tells us okay, probably labs only help you make a diagnosis, but you should have a use your clinical acumen to come to a diagnosis and then tailor your therapy accordingly and in the best interest of the patient. I think, have I shot my time? Or do I have time for third? Whatever you say.
Uh,
We can close probably. I can, whatever y'all say.
Yeah, we'll stop here, Girish, and we will take some questions because I think that will be more interesting. And so we will just stop here. And
Yep.
and, so I'll ask chairpersons, Dr. Ratnaparke sir and Dargar sir, if they are there, to have just quick comment on the talk or some clinical pearl on secondary causes of hypertension till the time Dr. Sharath sir will prepare his presentation. Chairpersons.
Yeah, this is Dr. Ratna Barke. Girish, it was fantastic lecture.
Thank you, sir.
But I think the commonest cause of resistant hypertension are the basically Pohn's syndrome and Cushing syndrome, hyperthyroidism, or these paragangliomas come very late in the list. What is your opinion?
So I think, so my third case was of Cushing's and there's another fourth case of Crohn's.
Because what routinely we see is a Cushing, Crohn's,
Yeah. So my
trauma, then all this hypothyroidism or parathyroidism we see.
so sir, if you look, I mean, obviously we being as a specialist, I think we often see rare disorders quite early,
Absolutely,
probably.
absolutely.
But
Second one,
obviously, if you look at, yes, sir.
Small question. First case, hyperthyroidism basically. The pulse rate of 90, was it really a concern? I think we may get about 100 only most of the time. Is it?
Most of the times, it's what I wanted to highlight was the nature of the pulse, the typical pulse that you have, bounding kind of a thing. You touch the I mean, you feel the pulse and you can make out that this patient has a hyperdynamic circulation. So
Right.
90 is not something, usually you'll see 100, 110, 120.
Yeah, that is
definitely
more
agree.
fun. Secondly,
third
this size of paraganglioma, 4 centimeter plus, is it very uncommon or common?
It is quite common. So most of these paragangliomas are usually silent, and as they increase, because blood pressure is something which gets often, treated without any evaluation for secondary causes. So usually this was done in this patient also. So they keep on expanding, and unless and until they cause pressure symptoms,
Compressions, yeah.
when they are picked up. And even in this, he presented with back pain, and that's because of compression, shear pressure.
Yeah, Dr. Dargar sir, please.
Yes, Girish, I think overall, I think as the sir said, the resistance hypertension, the endocrine causes are not that common, but I think it's a clinical suspicion, and if we really diagnose, the results are quite fantastic. We get a patient a good relief, can reduce the drugs very simply. Though I think as the Cushing, and these are much more higher level. The iatrogenic Cushing's, I think, probably coming a lot of the steroid use and all that thing, and other thing, pheochromocyta and also other thing. But I think the thyroiditis and other much cons, and I think you said the Cushing is much more common. But I think a high degree of suspicion for these rare causes like parathyroiditis is important, because I think you can give a very good result to the patient overall once you've been properly diagnosed. And for that, I think we need to know all the rare causes. I think the resistant hypertension much more common is, of course, the non-compliance of the patient, drug-induced, or the sleep apnea. They are much more common causes of even this. The endocrine causes amongst, I think, as you said, Cushing's, and these are more common. The cons actually, but I think cons is simple. He said even a potassium level high patient on ACE inhibitor. I think they're very easy step to suspect something, and I think then start working. on that, I think the simple. And as you said, I think of your metanephrine is a very simple test, non-fasting, no stoppage of any medication, food. Previously with the VMA, used to stop 3 days. This banana, chiku, all that things are nothing. And don't so cumbersome. All that things are nothing like that. You can diagnose it with a simple test and can make it. I think once the diagnosis is achieved, you're really happy that the patient has been given some a real good outcome for the rest of his life. Otherwise, he goes on just taking medication and still goes into. So that's a great Kirish to suspect somebody in a, I think, unusual way. Younger people, I think something with other associated symptom. Look for some endocrine causes is very, very important. And I think that is a very therapeutically useful to us. Thanks, Rajesh.
Thank you. Thanks, sir.
Thank you,
Right.
Girish. I think you should hold on. You have to stay back for final discussion. And one thing I learned from this discussion that any young hypertensive comes, just keep your antennas up, because both cases were young patients. So young hypertensive, we need to work up very. So thank you once again, Girish, and I hope you will stay back for the panel discussion. So next I am going to invite Dr. Sharath Seth sir for his deliberation. I think again this August audience doesn't require any introduction for Dr. Sharath Seth sir. Sir has been phenomenal, nephrologist par excellence. He has been head of department of nephrology at Ambani Hospital, and he has been more than 35 years plus of experience. There is a wonderful orator, great human being. So I'll ask Sharath sir to start his deliberation of newer calcium channel blocker and producer. Sharath sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rathi. Thank you, Dr. Dargar, Dr. Ratnaparki. And thanks to JB Chemical to give me the opportunity to talk on newer calcium channel blockers. And I shall be talking on a new topic, that is podocyte protection. Hypertension is the second leading cause of kidney failure next to diabetes. Of all the antihypertensive drugs that are available, we nephrologists obviously think more of renoprotective drugs, mainly ACE, ARBs, ARNI, and now CCBs. These newer CCBs are a little different from the older ones being nephroprotective. So let's classify these CCBs. Non-dihydropyridine, we know of long-acting verapamil, diltiazem. Dihydropyridine, long-acting mainly amlodipine, cilnidipine, benidipine, ifosfamidipine, and ezellnidipine. Intermediate, isradipine, and short-acting we rarely use now, nifedipine. The workplace of calcium channel blockers, they mainly work on alpha-1 unit. We also have alpha-2, beta, delta, gamma. But the important thing to remember is some work on high voltage, that is L-type, and P, Q, and N-type, while the low voltage ones are T-type calcium channel blockers. When it comes to drugs, we have to remember mainly three types of calcium channels, L-type, N-type, and T-types. This distribution of L-type is mainly in skeletal and smooth muscles and heart. N-types are neurons mainly sympathetic nervous system. T-types in the heart are in SA node. And very important to understand that T-types are very thickly populated in adrenal glands. The P and R types are not so important. So these L-types require strong depolarization, but once they are depolarized, they act for a longer period of time. And that is classical with amlodipine. It's long lasting. And T-types, like in SA node, they require very weak depolarization. And again, they are transient. They get inactivated also very fast. The N-types require strong depolarization. They are present in mainly sympathetic nerves. And they are blocked by specific polypeptide toxins. This is very important. Clinical significance of these three types. L-type reduces cardiac contractility, while it increases the pulse rate. So there is always a reflex tachycardia. While N and T types, they reduce heart rate and they reduce pulse rate. The L type increases intragranular pressure, leading to proteinuria. while NMT types, they decrease intraglottal pressure and they are hence renoprotective. The T types, as I said, thickly populated in adrenal glands, lead to increased aldosterone secretion, leading to resistant hypertension. So calcium channel blockers overall far better for stroke prevention than heart protection. They have side effects like headache, flushing, ankle edema, and classically the efficacy is not blunted by NSAIDs or by sodium intake because they are natriuretic. But the limitations of conventional calcium channel blockers made me give today's talk on newer calcium channel blockers. We all know them: pedal edema and lesser renal protection and reflex tachycardia. These T types, as I said, in SA node, very transient. It starts the action potential, then it is maintained by potassium channels and then slow sodium channels. This is a very interesting article in Frontiers of Endocrinology, where it showed that there is a privileged gate for calcium entry and control of adrenal steroidogenesis. If you see here, these L channels leads to calcium influx into the cytosol, wherein you have diacylglycerol, pyruvate kinase system, and inositol phosphate 3. All these are acted upon that. But when it comes to T channels, it directly enters the mitochondria from where the aldosterone is secreted. So these T channels are very important. And if a drug would block this T channel, it sizably would reduce the output of aldosterone. We go to one new calcium channel blocker, benidipine. It is classically lipophilic. As I said in my calcium channel blocker units, the alpha one was the most important unit. Most of the calcium channel blockers enter through the alpha blocker, one blocker. But benidipine, being lipophilic, seeps into the lipid layer and then seeps into the alpha 1, alpha 2, beta, delta, all other channels and enters through that. And hence we know that even though the blood level of benidipine goes down by 7 hours, the antihypertensive effect persists for 24 hours. Cilnidipine, we all know, act on L channels, that is on the smooth muscles of the vessels, and they reduce peripheral resistance and decrease vasoconstriction. But important thing about cilnidipine is they act on the N channels. These are sympathetic nerve endings which release norepinephrine, and they act on vessels producing vasoconstriction, which the cilnidipine will reduce vasoconstriction, will reduce tachycardia, and will less cardiac contraction, will reduce renin level, and will decrease the renal blood flow. So the newer CCBs reduce edema. The mechanism is they dilate the arterioles and no effect on the venules. So at the transcapillary level, the pressure builds up and leads to edema. But if you have a drug like cilnidipine or benidipine, which through N channel dilates the venules, so there is no transcapillary rise in pressure, so there is less pedal edema. Coming to kidneys, in the efferent arteriole, we have all 3 channels, L, T, and N. But in efferent arteriole, L channels are missing. We only have T and N channels. So the drug which acts mainly on L channel, that is amlodipine, would dilate the efferent arteriole, increase intraglottal pressure, lead to proteinuria. But the newer calcium channel blockers, which mainly act on T and N channels, would dilate the efferent arteriole, reduce intraglottal pressure, and reduce proteinuria. So if you, to summarize, the CCB, the amlodipine, probably a very potent, most potent antihypertensive, is an incomplete CCB because it blocks L channels but has no effect on T and N channels. Going to the most interesting part of my today's talk, that is podocyte. Being a nephrologist, I'm very much used to this podocytopathy. If podocytes are damaged, they become leaky and they lead to proteinuria. This is a very interesting article by Weavers in Nature in 2009, which showed that in Drosophila, our common fly, Drosophila, the nephrocyte resembles mammalian podocytes. including the nephrin-based slit diaphragm. And a lot of study on podocytopathies were done using this Drosophila. The novel podocyte system might open new avenues towards the understanding of podocyte biology and pathophysiology. I'm thankful to Dr. Ratna Parkhi. I think I have taken this slide from one of his slides, which we were co-speakers. Thank you, Dr. Ratna Parkhi, because I found this slide very interesting. It depicts podocytes so well with secondary processes, pericells, and a filtration slit. This is the filtration slit, and which is made up of mainly nephrin and podocin. So they help maintain the normal renal function, these podocytes, and if they are damaged, they lead to glomerular damage. So the podocyte injury leads to proteinuria, reduction in filtration barrier. Effacement is typically associated with proteinuria. Any podocytopathy leads to effacement of podocyte, and when the podocytes are effaced, at certain places in the renal epithelium, there is tear because of effacement or fusion of podocytes. And this tear leads to proteinuria. So there is a continuous process of podocyte depletion. If you see here, podocyte injury, the factors genetic, we all know very well, in focal, segmental, glomerulosclerosis, Finnish type, and various genetic disorders. Then we have metabolic, then we have oxidant, diabetes, malignant hypertension, toxins, immune system infection. These are all things which will produce podocyte injury and lead to depletion of podocytes, which activates renin-angiotensin system. And if you have continuously activated renin-angiotensin system, it leads to glomerulosclerosis and end-stage renal disease. So this is called glomerular destabilization and progression hypothesis because of podocytopathies. And this was seen in diabetes. There are certain circulating inhibitors of autophagy. And Dr. Girish Parmar will know very well that this autophagy leading to proteinuria in diabetes is known to happen. Again, this is a podocyte disease. So the podocyte injury leads to podocyte stress, leads to podocyte apoptosis, depletion of podocin, nephrin, protein loss, end-stage renal disease, and glomerulosclerosis. So cilnidipine is found to suppress the development of urinary protein excretion in patients, and it prevents the development of proteinuria because it prevents podocyte injury. These renoprotective effects cannot be simply explained by only hypotensive effect. It is beyond, not because they are like ARBs and ACE, beyond hypotension or beyond control of blood pressure, they decrease proteinuria. Cilnidipine does not act that way. It acts on podocytes, and they act on renoprotective, which is greater than L type of CCBs. So they reduce angiotensin II, angiotensin II induce oxidative stress, direct antioxidative, suppress reflex sympathetic system activation, and suppress RAS activation, and prevent podocyte injury and protects the podocytes. This cilnidipine suppresses podocyte injury and proteinuria in metabolic syndrome rats. Now we come to certain excellent experiments done in Japan, as published in Journal of Hypertension. This data suggests, you will just see how marvelously these experiments are done on these rats. So this shows that we have Winster Kyoto rats, WKY, and spontaneously hypertensive rats, newly developed spontaneously hypertensive rats, which were treated with vehicle, that is methylcellulose, or with cilnidipine 33 milligram per kilogram per day, or with amlodipine 20 milligram per kilogram per day. See the interesting part of this study. How do we measure systolic blood pressure in rats? It is measured by tail cuff plethysmography. And 24 hours urine samples were collected at 14, 18, 22, and so on for 34 weeks. All animals underwent 24 hours acclimatization period in metabolic cage. Cage is before collection. Blood and kidney samples were harvested at the end of 36 weeks. Half of the kidney was snap fusion in liquid nitrogen to measure angiotensin II level, and other kidney sections were histologically frozen and stained by DHE and laser capture microdissection. And what do we find? Compared with amlodipine, cilnidipine greatly suppressed the progression of proteinuria in spontaneously hypertensive rats which were newly developed. These are main treated with cilnidipine as compared to ones that are treated with amlodipine. See, very interesting. The N-type calcium channels were demonstrated in all these histopathological slides. And the marker of N-type calcium channel is Wnt tumor type 1. So these podocyte-specific nuclear protein Wnt tumor type 1 and expression of N-type calcium channels were cultured in podocytes. And then they were studied by treating them with cilnidipine and with amlodipine. So as you can see here very well, the podocyte injury revealed by Desmin staining, which I will show you in the next slide, mesenchymal RNA expression and the angiotensin, Desmin staining, the podocyte and podosin and nephrin. They all podocyte and nephrin levels went down with amlodipine, which was preserved when it was treated with cilnidipine. So cilnidipine treatment decreased renal angiotensin 2 level, but amlodipine had no effect. And see, this is the Desmin staining. If you see spontaneously hypertensive rats, this is a red classical Desmin staining, which you will see, continue to see when they are treated with amlodipine also, but they disappear when it is treated with cilnidipine, indicating that podosin and nephrin are not depleted. They are intact and they are protected when you treat them with cilnidipine. So to conclude, cilnidipine suppressed the development of proteinuria in spontaneously hypertensive rats, which amlodipine did not, possibly through the inhibition of N-type calcium channels, which were found to be thickly populated in the glomeruli. And the inhibiting effect of cilnidipine on renal RAS system and oxidative stress involved is beneficial effect in metabolic syndrome patients. The present findings suggest that cilnidipine treatment could be an asset in the therapeutic strategies in hypertensive metabolic syndrome patients by protecting the podocytes. Now, this was in 2010, and then in 2012, another interesting feature was found, and that was that probably this calcium channel inhibition with cilnidipine elicits glomerular podocyte protection independent of sympathetic nerve inhibition. So to find out whether they are independent of sympathetic nerve inhibition, we studied innervated and denervated rats. So 2 weeks prior to this, one right kidney was removed, urenephrectomized, and see how the denervation of the left kidney was accomplished by cutting off all the vessels, the nerves around the hilum, stripping of the renal artery and veins, adventitia, and treating them with phenol and ethanol, so that all sympathetic nerves were destroyed and denervated. And this denervation was further confirmed by measuring norepinephrine level, and this was found to be negative. So now we compared animals which were denervated, which were treated with cilnidipine, and which were treated with amlodipine. So the denervation reduced or attenuated the levels of blood pressure, as we all know, because sympathetic nervous system, the N-terminal ending drugs, cilnidipine or calcium channel blockers, definitely would act over there. But cilnidipine was found to be effective in both innervated and denervated and induce significant antihypertensive effects. The data indicate that renal nerves have a limited contribution to the cilnidipine-induced renoprotective effect in denervated rats. Now this cilnidipine markedly reduced the blood pressure, which was not affected with amlodipine. And this was another Wnt tumor 1 marker, and they studied all the N-terminal channels in innervated and denervated rats. So to conclude, friends, cilnidipine suppressed proteinuria and albuminuria by attenuating injury in denervated and innervated rats. Innervated, it was because they were acting on the N-terminal channels of sympathetic nerve endings. But the latest finding was the renoprotective effect of cilnidipine is probably independent of renal sympathetic nerve inhibition, and it has direct effect on the beneficial effect on the podocyte. The clinical evidence of newer calcium channel blockers, we have JATOS study for ifosfamide. As you know, 20 and 40 milligram, JATOS study was very prominent effect of ifosfamide. For benidipine, we have J-BRAVE study. These are all Japanese studies. For cilnidipine, we have Carter study. These are all various studies. It's a multi-center, open-label, randomized trial to study the effect of cilnidipine as compared to amlodipine. Similar participants in both the arms, and we found that urinary protein creatinine ratio was markedly reduced in cilnidipine as compared to amlodipine. So the Carter study concluded greater anti-proteinuric effect than amlodipine. There were many more, the Japanese studies, again 35 hypertensive patients, they were treated with RAS inhibitors, and then either cilnidipine or amlodipine was added. And we found that systolic blood pressure is equally reduced, but when it came to proteinuria, cilnidipine was far superior in reducing proteinuria as compared to amlodipine. The antioxidant deoxyguanosine was reduced much more with, so probably it is antioxidant also, cilnidipine. The Kyoto cilnidipine study, again, both arms were treated with L channel, that is amlodipine, and then one arm substituted with cilnidipine. And we found that the moment they were switched over to cilnidipine, the proteinuria markedly got reduced. So this is head-to-head comparison with amlodipine and cilnidipine in Kyoto study. And these are many more Japanese studies, again, multi-center, open label, the 48 weeks duration with cilnidipine, head-to-head comparison with amlodipine. And all these studies concluded here that though blood pressure reduction was equal in both the arms, the proteinuria reduction was much more in cilnidipine arm. So there is significant podocyte protection which contributes to anti-proteinuric effect, and also the hemodynamic effect. As I said earlier, the afferent arteriole contains L, N, and T channels. The efferent arteriole contains N and T channels. So those drugs which dilate the efferent arteriole, they reduce intraglmerular pressure, they reduce proteinuria, and in addition to that, they have selective protective effect on the podocyte. So renoprotective drug of these newer calcium channel blockers, mainly especially cilnidipine, is because of its podocyte protection, dilatation of both afferent and efferent arterioles, so there is no rise in intraglmerular pressure. Aldosterone inhibition more seen with T channel blockers, which are ifosfamide and azilnidipine. Natriuretic effect is sustained in the older one, amlodipine, and the newer calcium channel blockers. All of them have natriuretic effect. So even if a person is not restricted his salt intake, or sometimes they concomitantly take NSAIDs, even then the CCBs are protected and they continue to have its good effect. Probably there is increased nitric oxide formation in the renal parenchyma with newer calcium channel blockers. That leads to their more vasodilatory benefit as compared to the older calcium channel blockers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I welcome questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sharat sir. That was an excellent overview of calcium channel blocker with older as well as newer ones, especially newer ones. So I'll have a quick comment from chairperson, Dr. Ratna Bhargava sir, to begin, and Dargar sir, and then we'll have a 15-minute discussion following that. Ratna Bhargava sir.
Dr. Sharat said, it's excellent lecture as usual. My question, how you place these all newer molecules, that is ifosfamide, benidipine, cilnidipine, and azilidipine in your current practice?
See, like amlodipine, probably the next to amlodipine is cilnidipine, which is time tested. And this was mainly first chosen by nephrologist. As we all know, cilnidipine is quite effective. They definitely reduce proteinuria. The only disadvantage is that you need to give in a double dose of that of amlodipine to be as effective as amlodipine. And also probably cilnidipine you need to give 2 times a day. Against amlodipine, once a day is sufficient. When it comes to benidipine, they say once a day is okay, but ifosfamide and azilnidipine, again 2 times a day. Mainly azilnidipine and ifosfamide work mainly through T channels, while cilnidipine benefit is mainly through N channel.
How will choose whether this patient should be given amlodipine or cilnidipine in a moderate hypertension, coming to without any without any renal disease?
Yes, obviously, the first drug of choice is amlodipine, the small dose 2.5 milligram, especially when there is no proteinuria. And as we go on, probably we may have to increase the dose of amlodipine subsequently. And when patient complains of pedal edema or proteinuria, then you probably have to backstep and take off amlodipine, and then the role of cilnidipine comes in, along with RAS blockers. The most popular combination is cilnidipine with RAS blockers, both being renoprotective and antiproteinuric, are beneficial.
Dr. Dargad sir, please.
Yes, thank you, Sharath. It's actually very excellent. This concept of podocyte actually and the protection of the renal, I think is very important in this, all the newer calcium. We had, luckily, I think 4 new calcium channel blocker in 3 to 4 years. But Sharath, mainly the disadvantage of all this we're talking about, the BP reduction was not as powerful as amlodipine. That was a major challenge for them. And I think we, as you said, double dose of the compared to the amlodipine was effective. So I think nephrologist choice became sildenafil. Of course, after that, ephedrine and azeldipine and benadipine, all the 4 choices are available, but definite advantage. I think 2 reasons when we used to switch over, I think proteinuria, renal protection, and tachycardia is other reason. I think many of these calcium channel blockers don't cause tachycardia reflux, and that's a major advantage. So I think one good news from the JB Chemicals is they got a permission for azilsartan and sildenafil combination, which will be, because we have at least a potent ARB with a comparatively less potent calcium channel blocker. So the total effect of the blood reduction is good. They got already 40 milligram, because compared to telmisartan and olmesartan, we already proved that azilsartan is more potent as far as the BP reduction is concerned. So I think with the use a double dose of sildenafil, they got now the permission for only 10 milligram. If they get for 20, I think that will be a very powerful drug. They didn't get a permission for amlodipine, but I think sildenafil already they have got approval. And I think the whole aim is to control the maximum number of patients, actually, the blood pressure reduction. That brings all the benefits of the hypertension with the proteinuria. I think this podocyte and other concepts are the newer concept. But first aim is to bring down the blood pressure with a, if possible, single pill where the compliance of the patient can improve. I think in that situation, I think the newer combination will help. And sildenafil, of course, is a nephrologist's major choice, but the proteinuria reduction, as you said, and I think the long-time benefits of the patient. Though only thing is all the trials which you showed, Japanese, are very small numbers-wise. There we lead really a big trial of 4,000-5,000 patients. They all are 200, 300 patients, some 24, 26 weeks. I think there will be some major. Of course, there's a lot of data available to us, and we all been using it. But I think only the BP reduction is required. Again, people have to go back many times to amlodipine. I think we should need a very powerful combination like azilsartan and this newer calcium channel blocker. They might serve. And I think if we get a permission for a diuretic to be combined, I think we'll be able to control quite a major part of our blood pressure patient with a single pill probably. That should be the futuristic approach. We have a calcium channel, powerful ARB, and thiazide like diuretic can be get in one pill. We'll be able to control at least 80-90% of the population. So I think there is a role for this newer calcium channel blocker and the renal protection. Thank you.
You're mute.
Sir, Sharath sir, can you just stop sharing the presentation and then we can have everyone on the main screen? Okay. I think Girish has left because he has some commitment to do, so he has just left. So there are a couple of questions which has come up, and probably I think most of them are answered, but very simple, very practical question to probably to Ratna Parki sir and as well as Sharath sir and Tigat sir. So looking at all the data, looking at all this podocyte production, so any patient who is a diabetic hypertensive who was on amlodipine, say 5 milligram, the moment you see the creatinine is going to 1.4, 1.5, proteinuria 1 plus, so is it rational to switch from amlodipine to any one of these newer CCB? Is this should be the way forward, or we should still hold on? So what Sharath sir, Ratna Parki sir and Dargad sir? Sharath sir.
No, obviously, as I said, the proteinuria is the biggest drawback of amlodipine. The moment you see proteinuria in a diabetic kidney disease, you obviously choose renoprotective antihypertensives, that is ACE-ARBs, and beyond ACE and ARB, we have this newer calcium channel blocker, cilnidipine. doing the same job.
Ratnaparthi sir, in your hypertensive patient, the moment you see creatinine going little haywire and protein urea 1 plus, you are compelled to change or you still will wait for some time?
First, the theoretically, a combination of ACE inhibitor ARBs with amlodipine is quite neuroprotective. But there are so many sporadic small studies where they compared ACE inhibitor ARBs and amlodipine and ACE inhibitor ARBs with newer channel blocker. They have shown that the proteinuria or progression of renal disorder diseases is very slow in other newer anti-hypertensive CCBs. So theoretically, yes, we should switch, or as soon as we find there is increase in the creatinine or albuminuria, we should switch to a newer calcium channel blocker with ARBs. Okay, but again, there is a lacking of huge data. One thing. Secondly, there is no outcome data, and thirdly, it is not recommended in the guidelines. So these are three negative points of this combination. But concept-wise, and theoretically, yes.
Sir, you
I think the first thing is anywhere proteinuria or creatinine. I think first aim is to bring down the blood pressure to the level of the sprint trial, what we say 130/80. If you are not able to achieve that blood pressure, nothing going to work. I think the achieved of the blood pressure, still there is proteinuria or a reflex tachycardia or the edema of feet. I think then all the roles of the newer calcium channel definitely come. If you are able to control the blood pressure well, and you can take other factors which can cause the renal damage, I think you can save the kidney to a great extent. But I think we are never able to achieve the blood pressure control in 70% of the population first, actually. That's the biggest challenge, I think. And I think with a good, powerful ARB and this combination, we will be able to control the larger population. Then automatically we can reduce this nephric renal complication of it. So first is, I think aim is to, of course, those people who can't tolerate amyloid because of very huge edema or getting reflex tachycardia or the side effects, I think, then I think definitely the newer calcium channel BEFE. And as Dr. Ratnaparthi told, there is not a very large scale trial or guideline base or in a not still these are come. Maybe soon they might get it, but I think today at least amlodipine as a calcium channel blocker or they have a at least guideline base. I think nifedipine sometimes it's quite useful in some of the patient, I think, where we can't able to control the blood pressure. I think the sustained release preparation also are very useful, though other older groups actually. But I think there is a role for the newer calcium whenever there's a side effects like edema and other thing.
Yeah. So second question which has actually come up is once you start this N type of calcium channel blocker, there is a tendency to lower your heart rate also. So sometimes you really sometimes there is some kind of bradycardia. So whether you cut down on doses of beta blocker once you start this newer CCBs, is there any rationale for that, or we just continue and wait and watch? So Ratnaparthi sir, to start with you.
Basically, the heart rate reduction by all these newer CCBs is hardly 1 or 2 beats per minute.
2 to 4 maximum. That no.
Okay, so belidipine and efinodipine, they're all less than 1 to 2 beats per minute. So there is no indication to stop the beta blocker. What's the second question?
No, whether we should cut down dose or we should
not at all. If it is patient is going to very severe bradycardia, so change the dose of beta blocker. Okay. But I don't think that will cause any so significant bradycardia.
I think, Kapil, all these newer calcium channels don't cause tachycardia. That's a major advantage. Their BP, the pulse rate reduction is only by 2 to 4 maximum actually that we're getting. But that's an added advantage to these people. And of course, your pulse rate, unless goes below 60, we need not have to cut down the beta blocker in any case. I think desirable is 60 to 65. We don't need other drugs actually. So if a patient can come up to 60, 65, is a more desirable from your patient who have coronary artery disease or associated thing. So unless it's below 60, I think you need to cut. And that much effect, I think this newer calcium channel don't have to bring down the pulse. But somebody is on amlodipine, which was causing tachycardia, and now you have switched over to the newer drug. So there will be relatively, the pulse rate will be stable, a little better. It will not go up tachycardia. So in that case, if they really go down below 60, then only you cut down the beta blocker. Otherwise, no need of cutting down the beta blocker.
Sharath sir, one question to you: whether you are combined amlodipine plus newer like cilnidipine both together in a given patient?
I mean, Dr. Dargad will know it very well, and probably many a times
somebody will be put in jail.
Yeah.
That was the UK.
A nephrologist, he says in open forums that having given cilnidipine in full dose even when the pressure is not under control, he adds amlodipine to bring the pressure under control. And that is true. Amlodipine is definitely much more powerful antihypertensive as compared to cilnidipine.
But I
So
think
it
there's
can be
one
done.
concept
It
where
can
they
be
said
done.
dipyridamine and pyrimidine group. I think you can combine with verapamil or diltiazem, the calcium channel blocker,
Yeah.
with a amlodipine or something, and that together can bring down much better blood pressure reduction, but not the same group actually. I think that will be irrational anyway. Not be no guidelines or no will really approve it. Though of the label you can use in your personal patients, what you want to use is 2 calcium channel blocker, but no scientific forum will allow it to do it. I think like definitely.
Ratnabarki sir, in clinical practice, what is the percentage of one resistant hypertension and two, what are the causes of secondary hypertension? So in your clinical practice, there is a question coming up: how many percentage of patients will you see resistant hypertension and secondary causes of hypertension?
Again, theoretically, the resistant hypertension contributes 5% of the overall patients. The patients coming to cardiologist, the percentage increases to 20%. And the patient coming to nephrologist, the percentage increases to 40%. Okay. And fortunately or unfortunately, because of resistant hypertension, again, 80 to 90% is a renoparenchymal vascular disease. So, sir is smiling. Okay, so 80 to 90% causes of secondary hypertension whirls around the kidney, rotates around the kidney and kidney vasculature. Remaining 10% of that particular subgroup is endocrine diseases, and out of that 2% are still there are no reasons why it's happening like that. Okay, some dystonias and all these non-specific diseases are there that contributes 2% of that 5% of secondary hypertension.
Resistant hypertension. But I think apart from pharmacotherapy, we are now getting some mechanical things which will come up again, like renal denervation or carotid artery things. I think are advancing. So all those people who had 1 or 2%, also which were actually totally pharmaco resistance, actually, in spite of ruling out all other causes, actually, will also get some newer therapies which are interventional therapies, which I think futuristic will be. We should be able to control all the 100% of the population, and there should not be left anybody with a resistant hypertension. I think future devices are coming up very fast. I think again, renal denervation is coming back with some new data, and even the carotid artery that bulbs as they're putting, and some other pacemakers and other things are coming up. I think that may probably cover the remaining that 2% of the population also.
That is in 2019, the ESC has given inclination toward the thinking of this renal degeneration therapy in such situations. One, even ADA, in addition to that, say that renal degeneration and BAT, what we call calling BAT, is baroreceptor activation therapy. The BAT therapy and renal denervation therapies may be restricted in some population only. Okay.
Dr. Rathi, we have a new terminology called refractory hypertension.
Yes.
And beyond resistant hypertension, even after using 5 or more drugs, if the pressure
refractory
hypertension, where this tremendous role of alpha, centrally acting alpha agonist, that is your clonidine and oxynidine.
So, sir, one question to Sharad sir to you. In a dialysis patient, in a patient who's on dialysis, whether the choice of all these antihypertensive, especially I'm talking about CCB, whether it changes, because we have shown that benidipine is more lipophilic and other are more of hydrophilic kind of thing. So anything changes the patient who's on dialysis?
No, we have certain drugs which are non-dialysable. The non-dialysable ones are all CCBs. The newer, the older, the ARBs. So they are preferable because they are not dialysed out. But if one is given ACE inhibitors or beta blockers, they are dialysed out, especially atenolol. But the newer beta blockers are again non-dialysable. So alpha beta combination carvedilol is the drug of choice to control blood pressure during dialysis. So we select accordingly.
I think even nifedipine is quite favorite of some nephrologists use sustained release. In where the BP is a really problem, we can go with a very high dose, 20
for refractory hypertension.
Refractory sometimes actually.
Kapil, regarding this dialysable and thing, benidipine like molecule, particular benidipine, into the membrane. So whatever plasma benidipine can be dialyzed, but the attached benidipine to the membrane can act on the receptor and produces sustained hypotension effect. So there are studies with benidipine that it may be used in a dialysis patient as well.
Okay. Otherwise, generally all CCBs are dialysable.
Non-dialyzable.
Non-dialysable. That is what is the take-home message. So that is very important because a lot of these patients, we have to give this drug, and we are actually confused. That was a very important point. That atenolol is something which, anyways, we don't use that much. But this carvedilol will be the drug of choice in given patient of on a CKD. So that is very important. Sir, Sharat sir, just want to ask one thing. Where do you put hydralazine in your armamentarium to treat your patient on hypertension? I'm talking about resistant hypertension.
Exactly. The fourth drug of choice would be hydralazine. After ACE, ARB, calcium channel blocker, diuretic, if the pressure is not under control, of course, the fourth will be anti-aldosterone antagonist if potassium permits, there is no hyperkalemia. And then the fifth one would be direct acting on the muscle, that is hydralazine. Either plain hydralazine or hydralazine with isosorbate
Isosorbate
combination.
combination.
Yeah.
And then the last would be alpha-1 agonist, that is clonidine.
Yeah.
and
So
norepinephrine.
that was my question. So whether you will go first with alpha blocker or you go with hydralazine first. That is what is question. One to nephrologist.
Alpha blocker first.
And Ratnapargi sir, you will go to alpha first and then hydralazine.
Again, ESC guidelines mention first drug ACE-ARBs, second calcium channel blocker, third MRI antagonist, fourth if there are compelling indications the new beta blockers, right? Alpha plus beta blockers, carvedilol or levodopa
So
or nebivolol,
Yeah.
and no compelling indication, then hydrogen and clonidine like this. This is what the flow chart of ESC 2019.
okay.
Patient with heart failure, hydrazine may be more useful before even clonidine. I think can be a patient with a congestive cardiac failure. I think hydrazine isosorbate might be a very good. Where many times you can't use ACRB because of potassium problem and the Sharat's patient. I think hydrazine isosorbate combination can be a good choice to at least help the patient for a congestive cardiac failure.
Ratna sir, you were having some comment on that. Yeah.
Who?
Yeah. You were having some point to say on hydralazine.
No, I mean this is what the ESC guideline mentioned. Heart failure itself is a different topic.
Yeah.
So the up titration of all these things and addition of another diuretic before adding hydralazine. Okay. Before adding in heart failure hypertensive patient, if you want to add, you have to add thiazide like diuretic. Then you have to switch to the hydralazine. Hydralazine is very toxic effect and the dose required is tedious.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's already combined nitrate. That is also 3 times a day. Significant side effect profile is there. If you use the combination of hydralazine and
Headache is major problem.
So
significant hypertension is the problem. Kapil.
Yeah. So one more question. I think we'll just wind up to Sharat said, sir, because there are a lot of people who still has got some confusion regarding CKD and ACE-ARB. So just have a quick word on ACE-ARB, how to start, how to monitor, when to stop. Sharat sir.
This is the most unfortunate part, that even people are scared of using ACE-ARBs, though it is known that they are excellent renal and cardioprotective drugs. So the worst thing to happen to a patient is to not to give ACE-ARBs, and I would continue giving it even up to 5 creatinine, with up to 30 ml GFR very safely, as long as there is no hyperkalemia. And abroad, they definitely insist on that we may have to give Petiromer along with ACE-ARBs, but see to it that you keep on giving ACE-ARBs. Now, there is one STOP-S trial going on in UK now, and that probably will favor ARNI or Vimada when the GFR goes below 30 ml per hour. So therein probably Vimada or ARNI will be preferable there over ACE-ARBs, but up to 30 ml GFR, ACE and ARBs have to be there for renal and cardio protection.
Yeah. So only thing
We
is
today
that
have much better drugs for potassium actually lowering, and
Yeah,
we'll
yeah.
soon get it.
They
also.
have, which we don't have, unfortunately.
So
probably it will come, but we need to monitor creatinine and potassium every weekly.
So that is very important. So monitoring of creatinine and potassium, and look for GFR less than 30, then you need to take a very sensible call. But potassium, anything going more than 5.5, you need to stop. That is the take-home message.
Yes.
Yeah. So Ratnapargi sir, in cardiac practice also we go to the same thing, or we have got some other factors to actually cut down the dose of to increase the dose. Ratnaparki sir.
I didn't get the question because net
yeah,
problem.
so in cardiac practice also, like, you know, here they monitor potassium and GFR till 30. In cardiac practice also we do same, or we keep on increasing the dose till the time we get the desired result?
No. Whenever patient is on ACE inhibitor AR base, proper meticulous follow-up with EGFR is important. Most of the general practitioner see only creatinine. Creatinine is subjective. As the age increases, it comes. So do not believe on creatinine. Always go for EGFR, and that is a good marker where to stop the ACE inhibitor ARBs, right?
Yeah. So I think
It remains the same. What Dr. Saraset has said, it remains the same.
yeah. So I think we are done with maximum question. Any comments from the panelist or expert? Final comment before we wind up, because we have covered subject in detail, and unfortunately Girish has left, so we could not take that much of question. But any final comments from Sharat sir to start? How do we go? And podocyte is very important. Unfortunately, there are no marker to measure podocyte destruction except this surrogate. So how is sir any drug in future where we will have a total podocyte production, or we have to still go with this newer CCP which are at present the best drug to protect podocytes?
As I said, I showed 2010 and 2012. These are two excellent studies done in rats on cilnidipine, especially for the podocyte protection. This was exclusive and extensive study, and very scientifically they demonstrated it. Beyond that, there are no other studies for podocyte protection.
Final comments from Ratnaparki sir, and then the others.
See, I remember beta blocker. There was an atenolol molecule, very widely used, 2 decades, 3 decades. Then the concept of central aortic pressure came into the picture, and then there was shift of atenolol from atenolol to metoprolol or newer antihypertensive, right? Similarly, the same concept is coming in the CCBs also. The concept of L, N, and T blockade and podocyte injury. The only amlodipine, which is a king of CCB right now, okay, acts only on L. So there are subtle effects which will definitely have some clinical benefits, which the drug, if they are acting on N and L. So afferent pressure difference, which is the main effect of this N and T channels. Okay, so that will decrease the protein area. So this concept is very well tested in most of the trials. Although Dr. Dargada says they are small trial, agreed. But still, Jade Brave trial is of 8,000 patients for 2 years. Another trial is of 3,000 patients for 2 years. So this concept is definitely acceptable. Okay, glomerular hypertension has to be reduced by dilating efferent. Similarly, edema, increasing the vasodilation. So this concept has to be accepted first, and it to be tested by large scale studies. Once it is there, and then amlodipine will definitely have tough time, and that may be switched over by newer calcium channel blocker. Just like atenolol has been replaced by metoprolol or newer beta blocker. Similar may happen in calcium channel blocker also. This is what my take home of this particular podocyte and N and T channel effects.
Yeah, Dargad sir, last comment.
Thank you, Kapil. I think thanks to both the speaker, I think done an excellent job. Girish, of course, covered the very interesting cases on endocrine and I think the rare cases. But I think the Sharat Seth has brought this new concept of this podocyte and the protection of the kidney, either proteinuria. What my aim is to, I think, to message to our general practitioner, whatever method we are using, must bring down the blood pressure. I think that will save the mankind. That will save the country. If you bring down how many people we are bringing down, we are not even 30% people are brought down under control what is needed. What drug you have to use as per the convenience of the patient, is calcium channel blocker and improve the compliance of the patient and the maximum patient. I think that's the most easily preventable cardiovascular risk factor, hypertension, with all the beautiful drugs available to us, with I think all the very different mechanism and their side effects are very minimum. It's much easier than the sugar and lipid management, but still with the one of the poorest part. So I think the newer drugs definitely help in protecting the kidney, reducing the tachycardia, other side effects like edema, and slowly maybe switch over if more and more data will generate it. But I think these calcium channel block definitely have a role. But whole aim is, I think, the general practitioner level. Don't think that 140/90 is okay, I'm taking my patient. Try to then aggressively control and bring down at least diabetic population, some renal to 130/80. That should be the targeted with best available drugs. And I think we are getting good newer drugs, especially what I told of azilsartan and calcium channel. First time got the permission. I think diuretic also took 2 years and it took 4 years for thing. I think that's a newer concept. I think that will help us, lot of us people, to get the good patient control. I think that's the best thing.
Yeah. So thank you very much. So I sincerely thank Dr. Sharat Seth sir for taking out time and in giving us this talk. Wonderful talk, sir. Highly appreciated. Thank you so much. Thank you to Girish. He has left, but sincere thank to him for bringing up that two excellent cases. There were some more cases, but due to time we could not take. And last but not least, thank to my both chairperson who are always been there supporting us for conduct this kind of program again and again, Dr. Ratna Parki sir and Dr. Dargad sir, for their excellent overview on their pulse of wisdom. And last but not the least, our sponsors, JB Chemical, for coming up with this unique idea of this new kind of topic, and always there for a technical support. So I thank you once again, everyone, and I give it back to either Milan or Nitin from JB Chemical.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your wonderful moderation. In fact, I thank all the panelists and speakers and the chairpersons for a wonderful presentation. At the outset, I also thank all the attendees who have taken out time from their busy schedule and participated in this knowledge sharing platform. And looking forward for the future participation from all the esteemed doctors. At the end, I would like to wish you all the luck, care, and support in this corona fight. I believe that you are the true warrior, true fighter at the front end of this COVID fight, and I request all of you to take extra care for yourself and help mankind to come out of this difficult situation. Thank you, and with your permission, I am ending this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye. Take care.
Thank you. Bye bye. Stay safe.
Thank you very much.